I don't know what I remember most about that day, the bright slant of the sun through the windshield, or the terrible sound of twisting metal, the screech of rubber on wet asphalt, and my mother's scream as the car spun out of control. I was sitting in the back seat, holding a book I wasn't reading. My parents were talking in the front, words muffled by the storm outside. The rain had come in heavy sheets, blurring the world around us as we drove deeper into the forest. The last thing I saw was my father's white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel before the car slammed into something. A tree, maybe. There was a deafening crash, and everything went dark. When I came to, I was alone. The car was a crumpled mess, the front end buried in a gnarled tree. Rain still pounded against the cracked windows, and the air was thick with the smell of wet earth and something sharper, metallic. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but my head throbbed with each movement. My parents, where were they? I called out for them, but my voice was swallowed by the storm. Struggling against the seatbelt, I finally managed to free myself, clambering over the shattered glass and debris. The passenger seat was empty. The driver's seat, too. No blood, no sign of my parents at all. They had vanished. My breath hitched in my throat as I stumbled out of the car, my shoes sinking into the thick mud that surrounded the crash site. The rain soaked through my clothes instantly, chilling me to the bone. I was on a narrow road, the forest stretching endlessly on either side, trees like dark sentinels watching me with silent, impenetrable faces. There was nothing but the sound of the rain, no sign of other cars, no lights in the distance. I was alone in the middle of nowhere. "Mom, Dad," I yelled, the sound of my voice muffled by the heavy storm. Panic surged in my chest. They couldn't have gone far. They had to be nearby, maybe looking for help. I started moving, first down the road, then into the woods, my feet squelching with each step. I was a little boy, lost and scared, desperate to find my parents, but deep down I knew something was terribly wrong. The deeper I walked into the woods, the quieter everything became. The rain eased off, but the silence was suffocating, pressing in on me like a weight. The trees here were thick and ancient, their gnarled branches twisting together like skeletal fingers. It felt as though they were reaching for me, waiting for me to stray too close. It was then I noticed the shadows. At first, they seemed natural, the darkness between the trees, the thick undergrowth that blocked out the sky. But the more I looked, the more I realized they were moving. Slowly, like creeping figures, sliding through the underbrush. They weren't cast by anything. They were their own entity, lurking just beyond my vision. I turned back to the road, ready to run, but it was gone. Where the road had been just moments ago was now only an impenetrable wall of trees. Panic swelled in my chest. I spun around, trying to find my bearings, but the landscape had shifted. The forest was different now. The trees taller, the shadows darker. There was no path, no break in the woods, no way back to the car. I was trapped. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stumbled deeper into the woods, each step taking me further from where I'd started. The shadows thickened around me, and every now and then, I thought I heard something in the distance. A voice? No. It was too faint, too distorted. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every passing second. Suddenly, I heard something new. Not the rain, not the wind through the trees, but a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the sounds of the forest. But as I stood there, frozen, it grew louder. Closer. Tap, tap, tap. I turned toward the sound, my heart in my throat. Something was coming, moving through the trees, and with every step it took, the shadows around me seemed to pulse, as though they were alive. And then I saw it. A figure, tall, unnaturally thin, its form draped in the same shadows that filled the forest. It didn't walk so much as glide, its movements fluid and unnatural, as though it were made of smoke and darkness. Its face, or what should have been its face, was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, the rest of its body swallowed by the shadows that clung to it like a second skin. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure stopped, tilting its head slightly as though it had only just noticed me. Then it started moving again, this time directly toward me. I ran. I don't remember how far or how long I ran, only that I didn't stop. My legs burned. My lungs screamed for air, but the sound of tapping followed me, relentless. I could feel the presence of the thing behind me, always just out of sight, just beyond the edge of my vision. Finally, I burst through the trees into a small clearing. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The rain had stopped entirely now, and the forest was deathly still. I looked around, hoping, praying, that I had somehow lost it. But the tapping came again, closer this time. Tap, 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 and then the voice. It was soft, almost gentle, but there was something wrong about it, something that made my skin crawl. "Why are you running?" it whispered, the words sliding through the air like smoke. "Come back." I didn't want to look. I couldn't. But something in me, some primal, terrified instinct, forced my head to turn. The figure was standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me, and it wasn't alone. All around it, the shadows had taken form. They twisted and writhed like living things, slithering across the ground and up the trees, their shapes distorting into something vaguely human but utterly monstrous. I could see faces in the darkness now, hollow eyes, gaping mouths, all turned toward me. They were waiting. I backed away, my legs trembling so badly I could barely stand. But I couldn't run anymore. There was nowhere to go. The figure stepped forward, its shadowed form stretching impossibly long as it moved toward me. "Come back," it whispered again, and this time, I could feel the words inside my head, like icy fingers digging into my mind. I closed my eyes, squeezing them shut as tightly as I could, and screamed. But when I opened them again, the figure was gone. For what felt like hours, I sat trembling in the clearing, my chest heaving with every breath, my body drenched in a cold sweat. The forest around me was quiet again, too quiet. The absence of the tapping was almost worse than its presence, as though it was still there, just waiting for me to lower my guard. I had to keep moving. I stood up on shaky legs, casting one last glance at the trees where the shadowed figure had stood. It wasn't there anymore, but I could still feel it. The oppressive weight of its gaze, the way the shadows seemed to ripple and twist whenever I looked at them. They weren't normal shadows. They weren't supposed to move like that. I needed to find help, to find my parents, or at least a way out of this nightmare. The thought of my parents made my stomach twist painfully. Where were they? How could they have disappeared like that? Maybe they were somewhere deeper in the forest, looking for me, just as lost as I was. Or maybe, no, I couldn't think about that. I wouldn't. I forced myself to walk, even though my legs felt like they might give out at any second. The forest seemed darker now, more claustrophobic. The trees pressed in from all sides, their branches twisting and intertwining like skeletal arms. Every step I took felt wrong, as though I was being funneled deeper into some place I wasn't supposed to be. The path beneath my feet, if you could even call it a path, was narrow and overgrown, the ground soft and uneven. My shoes squelched with each step, the mud sucking at my feet, threatening to pull me down. I stumbled more than once, catching myself on low-hanging branches that felt strangely cold and slick under my fingers, like they were alive. As I walked, the shadows began to move again. At first, it was subtle, a flicker out of the corner of my eye, a slight shift in the darkness beneath the trees. But the further I went, the more they seemed to take shape. They slithered through the underbrush, curling around tree trunks, darting between rocks. I tried to ignore them, to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every step. Then, I heard it, a voice, faint and distant, calling my name. "Eli." I froze. It was my mother's voice. "Eli, where are you?" It was coming from somewhere ahead, deeper in the forest. My heart leaped into my throat. She was alive. She was out there, looking for me. I wasn't alone. "Mom!" I screamed, my voice cracking. "Mom, I'm here." There was no response, but the voice came again, a little louder this time. "Eli, come to me." I took off running, my exhaustion forgotten in my desperation to reach her. The forest blurred around me as I sprinted through the trees, ducking under low-hanging branches and leaping over fallen logs. My breath came in ragged gasps, my chest burning, but I didn't stop. "Mom!" I called again. "Mom, I'm coming." The voice continued to call, always just ahead, always just out of reach. But there was something wrong with it. The more I listened, the more I realized it didn't sound quite right. It was too soft, too hollow, like it was being carried on the wind rather than coming from an actual person. But I couldn't stop. I had to find her. I had to believe that she was out there, waiting for me. I burst through the trees into another clearing, this one larger than the last. The ground here was hard and uneven, covered in jagged rocks and patches of dead grass. In the center of the clearing stood a single tree, tall and ancient, its bark blackened and gnarled. Its twisted branches reached high into the sky, almost as if they were trying to tear it open. And there, at the base of the tree, was my mother. She was standing with her back to me, her long dark hair matted and wet, clinging to her clothes. Her shoulders were slumped, and she was swaying slightly, as though she were struggling to stay upright. My heart soared with relief. I had found her. I wasn't alone anymore. "Mom!" I cried, running toward her. "Mom, are you okay?" She didn't respond. She didn't move. "Mom!" I slowed down, something cold curling in the pit of my stomach. There was something wrong. Her posture, the way she stood so still, it wasn't right. I stopped a few feet away, my breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. "Mom!" Slowly, so slowly it made my skin crawl, she turned around. And that's when I realized it wasn't my mother at all. The thing that faced me had her face, or at least it wore her face, but it was stretched too tight, like a mask that didn't quite fit. Its eyes were wrong, too wide and glassy, staring at me with a hunger that made my blood turn to ice. Its mouth twisted into a smile, the corners of its lips pulling up far too high, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "Eli," it whispered, its voice a grotesque mockery of my mother's. "Come to me." I stumbled back, choking on my own breath. The thing took a step toward me, its limbs moving in jerky, unnatural motions, like a puppet being pulled on invisible strings. Its smile widened, splitting its face in two, and it let out a low, guttural laugh. "Come to me, Eli." I turned and ran, my legs moving on pure instinct, my mind screaming in terror. Behind me, I could hear the thing crashing through the trees, its laughter echoing in the darkness. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran, my feet pounding against the ground, my heart hammering in my chest. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees twisting and bending, their branches clawing at my skin as I pushed through them. The shadows moved faster now, darting between the trees, their shapes shifting and writhing like they were alive. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I could see them following me, always just behind, always watching. And the thing's voice, followed me too. "Eli, come back." I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing onto the cold, damp ground. My chest heaved, and I gasped for air, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The shadows swirled around me, whispering and shifting, but the creature wearing my mother's face, was gone. For now, I rolled onto my back, staring up at the sky. It was dark, a deep, oppressive black, with no stars, no moon, just an endless void stretching above me, pressing down on me like a weight. I was lost. There was no way out of this forest, no way to escape. I was going to die here. The thought hit me like a punch to the gut, stealing the breath from my lungs. I had tried so hard to stay strong, to keep moving, but it was hopeless. I was alone, trapped in a place that defied all logic and reason, and there was no one coming to save me. Tears blurred my vision, and I squeezed my eyes shut, letting them spill down my cheeks. I wanted to go home. I wanted my parents. I wanted. Tap, tap, tap. My eyes flew open, my heart leaping into my throat. The tapping was back. Slowly, I sat up, my muscles stiff and aching. The sound was closer now, louder, as though it was coming from right behind me. I didn't want to look. I knew what I would see if I turned around. But something, some awful, terrible force, compelled me to move, to twist my body around and face the source of the sound. And there it was. The figure stood at the edge of the clearing, just like before, its form shrouded in shadows. But this time, it wasn't alone. All around it, the shadows writhed and twisted, taking shape. I could see them clearly now, pale, hollow-eyed figures, their faces twisted into grotesque smiles, their limbs elongated and bent at impossible angles. They surrounded the figure, moving in slow, jerky motions, their eyes locked onto me. The figure raised its hand, and the tapping stopped. For a long, terrible moment, there was silence. The figures stood motionless, their hollow eyes fixed on me, their smiles stretching wider and wider. Then, the figure spoke. "Come back," it whispered, its voice slithering through the air like a snake. "You belong with us." I couldn't move. The figure stood at the edge of the clearing, a towering shadow against the backdrop of the twisted, ancient trees. Around it, those pale, grotesque figures swayed like they were caught in an invisible wind, their hollow eyes and distorted smiles watching me with a sickening intensity. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to cooperate. I was frozen in place, my mind trapped in a loop of paralyzing fear. The figure's voice echoed in my head, soft but relentless, wrapping itself around my thoughts like vines. "Come back." For a moment, I wondered if I should obey. Maybe it was easier to give in, to let whatever this was take me. The terror, the isolation. It was all too much. The forest seemed endless, a labyrinth of nightmares with no escape. And what was the point of fighting it? I was just a boy, lost and alone. My parents were gone, maybe dead, and there was no one to save me. But then, something inside me pushed back. A flicker of resistance, a memory of my mother's face, her real face, not the thing that had worn it like a mask. No, I thought. I can't. I won't. I forced myself to move, to turn away from the figure and its nightmarish companions. My legs were weak, trembling so badly I could barely stand, but I managed to stumble to my feet. The forest loomed around me, the trees thick and oppressive, their branches reaching down like skeletal arms. I had no idea where I was going, only that I needed to get away. Behind me, the tapping started again, louder this time, closer. I ran. The air was thick and heavy, each breath a struggle. My vision blurred as the trees flew past me in a chaotic blur of black and gray. The ground beneath me was uneven, slick with mud and tangled roots that seemed to reach out, trying to trip me with every step. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound echoing in my ears like a drumbeat. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear it, the soft, mocking laughter of the thing that had once worn my mother's face. The tapping followed me, a relentless, rhythmic sound that grew louder and louder, as if it was right on my heels. I dared not look back. I knew if I did, I would see them. The shadows, the hollow-eyed figures, their twisted smiles growing wider with every step I took. And if I stopped, even for a second, they would catch me. I kept running until the forest opened up in front of me, the trees giving way to a strange, new landscape. The ground here was different, harder, almost like stone, but cracked and uneven, as if something had tried to tear it apart. A faint mist hung low over the ground, swirling around my ankles as I moved. The air was colder now, biting into my skin, and the light, what little there was, had taken on a strange, sickly hue. I slowed to a stop, gasping for breath, my body shaking with exhaustion. I was disoriented, my mind clouded with fear and confusion. Nothing about this place made sense. The forest had been suffocating, but this felt worse. It was like stepping into another world, one where the rules of reality didn't apply. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. The trees that bordered the clearing were twisted and blackened, their branches gnarled and claw-like. Beyond them, I could see movement, shadows, shifting and writhing, just out of reach. The figures hadn't followed me into this place, but I could feel their presence, watching from the edge of the forest. Then I saw it. In the center of the clearing was an old, crumbling well. It was strange, out of place, like something from a forgotten time. The stone was weathered and cracked, covered in thick, dark moss. The opening was wide, a gaping mouth that seemed to swallow the light around it, leaving only darkness within. A wooden bucket, half-rotted and hanging by a frayed rope, dangled over the edge, swaying slightly in the cold breeze that swept through the clearing. I took a step toward it, then stopped. Something was wrong. The well shouldn't have been there. This place, none of it made sense. But the longer I looked at it, the more it felt like it was watching me, waiting for me to come closer. I heard a soft, familiar sound, the faint, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the well. My heart dropped into my stomach. I didn't want to go near it. I didn't want to see what was inside. But my feet moved on their own, dragging me forward, closer and closer to the well's edge. The tapping grew louder. I reached the well and peered over the edge, into the darkness below. At first, I saw nothing. Just an empty void, black and endless, as if the well had no bottom. But then, something moved, a ripple in the shadows, a shape shifting in the depths. And then I heard it. The voice echoed up from the well, soft and distorted, but unmistakable. It was my father's voice. "Dad?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "Dad, is that you?" The shadows inside the well shifted again, and for a moment, I thought I saw something. A face, pale and gaunt, staring up at me from the darkness. My father's face. But it was wrong, just like the thing that had worn my mother's face. It was stretched, distorted, and those eyes. "Come down," the voice whispered. "I'm here, Eli. I'm waiting for you. Come down." I stumbled back, my heart racing, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. No, I thought. This isn't real. This isn't my father. But the voice continued, soft and insistent, repeating the same words over and over. "Come down. Come back. You belong with us." I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to drown it out, but the words burrowed into my mind, wrapping around my thoughts like a cold, suffocating fog. I staggered away from the well, but the voice followed me, growing louder and louder until it was all I could hear. "Come back, Eli," it hissed. "Come back." I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the uneven ground as I bolted toward the edge of the clearing. The mist seemed to thicken around me, swirling up from the ground in thick, choking tendrils. The trees loomed ahead, dark and menacing, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. The forest was waiting for me, and the shadows with it. But I didn't have a choice. I couldn't stay here, not with that thing in the well, not with that voice. I plunged back into the forest, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I pushed through the thick underbrush. The shadows moved with me, keeping pace, but they didn't attack. They didn't need to. They were guiding me, pushing me further and further into the depths of the forest, away from any hope of escape. I don't know how long I ran. Minutes, hours, maybe even days. Time had lost all meaning. The forest seemed endless, a labyrinth of darkness and twisted trees that stretched on forever. The shadows were always there, just out of reach, but I could feel them watching, waiting for the moment when I would falter, when I would give in. Finally, I couldn't run anymore. I collapsed onto the ground, my body trembling with exhaustion, my lungs burning with every breath. The shadows crept closer, surrounding me, their twisted forms flickering in the dim light that filtered through the canopy of trees. The tapping had returned, soft and rhythmic, echoing through the forest like a heartbeat. I closed my eyes, tears streaming down my face. There was no escape, no way out. I was going to die here, in this place of shadows and whispers, and no one would ever find me. The tapping grew louder. And then, the voice came again, soft and familiar. And then, everything went black. When I woke, I was lying on the forest floor, my face pressed against the damp, cold earth. For a few moments, I couldn't move, my body frozen as though it had been carved out of stone. My mind was clouded, the memories of what had happened swirling like mist, slipping just out of reach. I tried to recall where I was, how I had gotten here, but all I could remember were fragments, the figure, the well, the voice. My body ached, every muscle stiff and sore, as if I had been lying there for hours, maybe days. Slowly, I forced myself to sit up, my head pounding with each movement. The forest around me was dark, the shadows deeper than ever, the trees looming over me like sentinels. The air was thick with moisture, heavy and oppressive, and every breath felt like a struggle. Something had changed. I couldn't explain it, but the forest felt different now. There was a weight in the air, an unnatural stillness that pressed down on me like a heavy blanket. The shadows no longer flickered or shifted. They were solid, almost tangible, as though the forest itself had come alive and was watching me, waiting. I stood up, my legs trembling beneath me. I needed to get out of here. I didn't care where I went or how I got there, but I couldn't stay in this place any longer. I had to keep moving, even if I didn't know where I was going. The only thing that mattered was putting as much distance between myself and whatever had been chasing me as possible. But as I started to walk, I realized something horrifying. The forest had changed. The path I had taken, the trees I had passed, all of it was different now. It was as if the forest had shifted while I was unconscious, rearranging itself into a new, more menacing maze. The trees were thicker, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes, and the ground beneath my feet felt strange, almost like it was pulsing with some hidden life. The further I walked, the more the feeling of being watched grew. Every step I took seemed to echo in the silence, the sound bouncing off the trees as though something was listening. I could feel it, the presence of the forest itself, a vast and ancient intelligence, lurking just beyond my sight. It wasn't just the figure or the shadows that had been following me. The entire forest was alive, and it was hunting me. I stumbled through the undergrowth, the branches tearing at my clothes and skin as I pushed my way forward. My legs were weak, and my vision blurred with exhaustion, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I had to find a way out of this nightmare before it consumed me completely. But no matter how far I walked, the trees never thinned. The forest stretched on endlessly, a labyrinth of shadows and whispers that offered no escape. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath came in ragged gasps, my panic growing with every step. Then, from somewhere deep within the woods, I heard it again, the tapping. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of my own footsteps, but it grew louder, more insistent, with each passing second. The rhythmic beat echoed through the forest like a heartbeat, pulsing in time with my fear. And this time, it wasn't just behind me. It was everywhere. I froze, my body trembling with terror. The tapping surrounded me, coming from all directions, as though the forest itself was alive with the sound. It was closing in on me, the invisible walls of the labyrinth tightening around me, leaving me with nowhere to run. And then, I saw them. The shadows emerged from the trees, their pale, hollow-eyed faces watching me with grotesque smiles. They moved slowly, deliberately, their twisted forms gliding through the underbrush like wraiths. There were dozens of them, maybe more, their figures shifting and merging with the darkness around them until it was impossible to tell where the shadows ended and they began. At their center was the figure. It stood tall and unmoving, its wide-brimmed hat casting its face in darkness, but I could feel its eyes on me. It was watching me, waiting, just as it had been all along. The tapping came from it now, echoing in the stillness like a drumbeat that marked the rhythm of my fear. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. The shadows followed, their smiles growing wider, their movements more erratic. They weren't in a hurry. They knew there was nowhere for me to go. The figure raised a hand, and the tapping stopped. For a moment, the forest was completely silent. The shadows froze, their hollow eyes fixed on me, their smiles stretching impossibly wide. I could feel the weight of their gaze, pressing down on me like a physical force, suffocating me with its intensity. Then, the figure spoke. "Come back," it whispered, its voice sliding through the air like smoke. "You belong here." I shook my head, stumbling back. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "No, I don't." "You do," the figure insisted, its voice soft but unrelenting. "This is where you were meant to be. This is your home now." I don't want to be here." My voice cracked, the terror overwhelming me. My back hit the rough bark of a tree, and I realized I was cornered. The shadows had closed in, forming a circle around me, their twisted forms writhing like they were barely contained. The figure stepped forward, and I pressed myself harder against the tree, desperate for some kind of escape. "You can't leave, Eli," it said, its voice dripping with a sickening kind of sweetness. "The forest doesn't let go of what it claims. You belong with us now." The words twisted through my mind like poison, and for a moment, I felt the cold fingers of despair wrap around my heart. I was trapped. There was no way out, no way to escape. The forest had taken me, just like it had taken my parents. I would never see them again. I would never see the outside world again. This was my fate. But then, something changed. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a flicker of light, barely visible through the dense trees. It was faint, almost like a mirage, but it was there, glowing softly against the darkness. It wasn't the cold, oppressive light of the forest, but something warmer, more familiar. A spark of hope. I turned toward it, my breath catching in my throat. Could it be? The figure seemed to sense my thoughts, and its voice took on a darker tone. "There is no escape," it hissed, its form shifting in the shadows. "The light is not for you." But I ignored it. With a burst of energy I didn't know I had, I broke free from the circle of shadows, sprinting toward the light. The trees whipped past me in a blur, their branches tearing at my skin and clothes, but I didn't care. I had to reach the light. I had to escape. The tapping returned, louder and faster now, chasing me through the forest like a predator stalking its prey. I could hear the shadows moving behind me, their grotesque forms slithering through the trees, their hollow eyes watching my every move. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The light grew brighter, closer, until I could almost feel its warmth on my skin. It was just ahead, through a break in the trees. If I could just reach it. A sharp pain shot through my leg, and I stumbled, falling hard to the ground. I gasped in pain, clutching my leg, only to find it tangled in a thick, black root that had erupted from the ground beneath me. The root pulsed with a sickly energy, tightening around my ankle like a vice, pulling me back toward the forest. "No!" I screamed, clawing at the ground, trying to free myself. But the root only tightened, dragging me inch by inch back into the shadows. The light flickered in front of me, so close yet so far. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, and I felt the cold breath of the shadows on my skin. And then, as I reached out one last time for the light, it blinked out. Darkness swallowed me whole. The forest was silent. The shadows had consumed me, their cold, twisted forms wrapping around me like a cocoon. The air was thick with the smell of earth and decay, and the darkness was absolute, pressing in from all sides, suffocating me with its weight. I was alone. For what felt like an eternity, I lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness, my body numb and my mind empty. The fear had drained out of me, replaced by a cold, hollow resignation. I had lost. There was no escape. I had been claimed by the forest, just like my parents. Just like all the others. I don't know how long I stayed there, wrapped in the shadows, but eventually, I became aware of a presence. It was subtle at first, a faint whisper in the back of my mind, but it grew stronger with each passing second. It wasn't the figure or the shadows. It was something deeper, older, more ancient than I could comprehend. The forest. It was alive. I could feel it now, its consciousness woven into every tree, every root, every shadow. It was vast, its tendrils stretching out into the darkness, pulling everything it touched into its embrace. The forest wasn't just a place. It was a living entity, ancient and relentless. It had watched me from the moment I entered, shifting its paths, hiding its secrets. It had let me run, let me fight, but all along, it knew I could never escape. The whispers grew louder in my mind, like the forest was speaking to me, not with words but with feelings, a deep, endless hunger. The shadows swirled around me, tightening their grip, their cold touch seeping into my bones. I was no longer scared. The terror had given way to a numbing sense of inevitability. I wasn't just lost. I had been claimed. The figure appeared in front of me again, rising from the shadows, its wide-brimmed hat casting its face in darkness. It extended a hand, long and thin, reaching toward me with an unnatural grace. "Eli," it whispered, "you're home now." I didn't fight it this time. I didn't run. I was too tired, too broken. The forest had taken everything from me. My parents, my hope, my will to survive. There was nothing left. The figure's hand touched my face, cold as death, and for a moment, I felt a strange sense of peace. The darkness wrapped around me like a shroud, and the shadows, once terrifying, now felt like old friends, welcoming me into their embrace. I could hear the faint sound of the tapping again, soft and rhythmic, like a heartbeat, in perfect harmony with the pulse of the forest. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me completely was the figure's smile, wide and grotesque, stretching across its face as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. And then, everything faded away. In the end, I became part of the forest, another shadow among the many. Trapped, like the others before me, my life swallowed by the endless dark. The tapping would continue, the figure would still walk among the trees, and the forest would wait patiently for the next soul to lose its way. Because once you enter, the forest never lets you go.